everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first ever live online event with the Legal Insurrection Foundation. My name is Kimberly Kay. I am Legal Insurrection Senior Contributing Editor, and I also work as the Director of Operations and Editorial Development for the Legal Insurrection Foundation, which are two separate entities. Thank you for being patient as we figure out this technology. A lot of it's a little bit confusing, but I think we have it figured out now. If not, we'll find a way to make it work. But we want to thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday evening to join us for this very timely discussion on constitutional rights in the age of governmental overreach. And I would like to go ahead and introduce my boss and the publisher of Legal Insurrection. He's also the president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation and a law professor at Cornell Law School, William Jacobson. He's going to lead the discussion. We will have a section for question and answers towards the end. For those of you who've asked questions, we went through and we're going to answer as many as we possibly can. So our readers, we really appreciate you taking the time to consider this topic and to take time to send us your questions. And we'll get to as many of those as we possibly can too. So without further ado, Professor Jacobson.
Hi, how are you? I'm glad everybody could be here tonight. And we have a very timely topic, one that's all over the news, that people are talking about. It really has dominated our lives for the last 6 weeks to 2 months. And that's the issue of the current pandemic, the virus that's spreading, but most importantly for tonight, to address the issue of how we can address what many people believe is government overreach. And what I'm going to do is I've got a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to give. And at the end, I'll answer some reader questions that were submitted through our website. And I'll give you a roadmap as to what I'm going to cover. So, and this is the first time we've done this live on Facebook or anywhere. So hopefully the technology will work okay. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint that I have. And so this is the topic tonight, is constitutional rights in the age of government overreach. And as mentioned, you probably know who I am if you're visiting this website, but if you don't know, my name is Bill Jacobson. I both teach at Cornell, and I'm the founder of both the Legal Insurrection website and Legal Insurrection Foundation. Kimberly is our Director of Operations and Editorial Development, and also is a senior contributing editor at the website. And she's been with us for over 5 years. And she's also affiliated with the Legal Insurrection Foundation. In case you don't know, Legal Insurrection Foundation is a little over a year old, and it is a 501c3 dedicated to research and education and investigations. And it also now runs the website. So we had a little bit of a reorganization a little over a year ago. This poem by William Butler Yeats is something I've posted on the website, and it really is the focus of the topic for tonight. It's on the current trajectory that we are going. How long can the center hold? And by that meaning, how long can the country keep going the way it's been going before things fall apart? I wrote about this back in March 19th. Which seems like it was 10 years ago. Time seems to be moving very slowly. Each week seems to be a year. But I wrote about this when a reader had sent me some photos of some of the main avenues in Manhattan that were like ghost towns. And I posed the question, how much longer could this go on? Of course, that was back in March. And I said, I'm not sure how much longer this can go on. I'm thinking Los Angeles, like after the Rodney King verdict and the riots during blackouts, food supply, electric supply, etc. But the point I made is the point a lot of people are making, which is you can't just stop an economy and expect it not to tear at the seams that hold society together. And I projected at that time that May would be the inflection point, that people simply would not tolerate what we were going through, that first 15-day social distancing period, would not tolerate it beyond May, maybe into early June, but that would be it. I think that's actually what's happening. I think we're at the point now where things are beginning to come apart a little, and I'm going to go through that and talk about that. And so the overview of what I'm going to cover, it's a bit of a spoiler, but I don't mind giving you a spoiler. The current lockdowns and shutdowns are not sustainable at the current rate. Social conflict is inevitable and has already started. That normally people look to the courts as a relief valve for social conflict. And I get a lot of emails, a lot of comments at the website about constitutional rights and what can we do about this. And I'll talk about that. But one thing you'll learn when you hear a little bit about the law of pandemics is that, except in some narrow circumstances, you probably cannot expect judicial relief here. That any relief with regard to the reopening of the economy is going to have to be through the political process. The courts are unlikely to help you here. But something needs to be done. The current trajectory is not sustainable, and we either move towards an easing of the restrictions, a reopening of the economy, or society, through no one's choice, is going to move towards social conflict and insurrection. We're seeing the very, very earliest elements of that. The structure of this presentation is that I'm going to go over the problem and the media-induced panic and the government reaction. Now, you know a lot of this. I'll just give a few examples because you watch the news and you're experiencing it. The unemployment surge, the unintended collapse of the healthcare system and people's health unrelated to the virus, the social strife that's starting, the online crackdown, and then I'm going to go over the legal aspects. The US Constitution, the provisions of the Bill of Rights, I believe, are implicated. The key case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, no relation, and how that is the case the courts still look to. Then I'll go over the law of pandemic, which is statutes, statutory, and also cases. And then I'll give you a conclusion and we'll have some reader questions. If I've timed this right, and I don't always do this, I'll go someplace around 35 to 40 minutes. Hopefully I don't run over because I realize people have a lot to do tonight. So the cause of the current problem is legitimate public health concerns about the virus. There are deaths, a lot of deaths taking place, a lot of illness taking place. So this is a legitimate public health concern. It is not concocted, it's not a pretext. But there have been a lot of questions as to the model predictions that caused a lot of the shutdown and how deaths are counted. We're not going to resolve that tonight, but that's the background that I think is getting a lot of people very frustrated because we were told certain things would happen and it's not nearly as bad as was predicted. So the model that everybody's been using, or a lot of people have been using, this University of Washington model, has changed over time. This is from the Washington Post, and they're constantly revising their model and their projections. And so we've somehow gone from a projection of millions dying to a projection of tens of thousands dying. Now, tens of thousands is a lot, but we've had other illnesses and diseases that have killed that many people. And so there's a concern here that maybe we embarked on a shutdown of the economy that was not justified. A lot of people will say, well, the reason these numbers are going down is because people are implementing the social distancing, but this model presumed that there would be social distancing. That's a whole argument there. There's also the issue of how they're counting deaths, which is anybody who dies, who tests positive for the coronavirus, is being counted as a death due to the coronavirus. And a lot of people say, well, isn't that really overstating the death toll? Because in Michigan, they just had Illinois, they just had a press conference with the public health director, who was extraordinarily clear that even if someone died of something else, if that person tested positive for coronavirus, they are going to be listed as a coronavirus death. So as a backdrop, and like I said, I can't resolve these now. I'm not sure I can ever resolve these issues, but I think there's a lot of suspicion there that the models and the way the numbers are counting is not the way we would normally expect it to happen. And there's also been a media-induced panic. I wrote a while ago that there are two things that are true here. One is that this is a serious public health issue, but two is it has also been highly, highly politicized. And those two things are true at the same time. Bill Maher had a segment. I don't often agree with Bill Maher, but when he's right, he's very sharp. And he pointed out how the media for months has been trying to scare people. And they've done a very good job of it. And it's one thing to present this as a serious health issue. It's another thing to hype it the way the media has been hyping it, scare tactics, what he called, some sort of, panic porn or something like that. The models that were also, the reaction to this panic has been this shutdown, which was not anticipated. This is from a recent Wall Street Journal article that not even the UK Imperial College study that so alarmed the world's policymakers recommended indiscriminate lockdowns and shelter-in-place orders. So something happened along the way. And what happened along the way is we went from being told that we need these restrictions to ease the burden on the medical system so that the medical system would not be overwhelmed with a surge of patients flocking to hospitals. And that's what we needed. And that's why we had these sweeping restrictions. And it has morphed into, now that the curve is being flattened, now that hospitals are sitting almost empty, not to say that there aren't some where there are issues, particularly in New York City, but the US health system, hospital system, is sitting mostly empty, which is causing its own problems. So we have flattened the curve to the extent that the hospital system is not at risk of being overwhelmed, yet they want to maintain these restrictions. And now the political rhetoric is we have to actually eliminate the virus. So that has changed. That is what resulted in these sweeping orders. And I'll mention a few of them, but you know them. It's stay at home, don't go outside. You can't go to certain stores can't operate. The restaurant industry has essentially collapsed. The hotel industry has essentially collapsed. The airline industry has collapsed. I was thinking and talking to somebody the other day, we had a legal insurrection reader event in Los Angeles back in February. And as I began to watch major parts of our economy collapse, I was thinking, almost every single person I met on that trip, from the airport in Rhode Island, to the airplane, to the airport at LA, to the car rental, to the hotels, to the restaurants, they are all unemployed. Almost every single person I met on that trip is now unemployed. And that's pretty shocking. And then there's been the other thing, which gets a lot of press coverage, and it really irritates people, that there are restrictions being placed that seem to have, in many cases, no rational connection to maintaining the public health. You cannot walk alone in the woods. You cannot go out on your boat in the middle of the lake alone. You can't do a lot of things. It just seems like government power for the sake of having government power. Attorney General William Barr has made some comments that the shutdowns and stay-at-home orders that are taking place now are approaching the equivalent of house arrest. Now, we only put people under house arrest after they've had a trial and they've been convicted after due process, or they themselves are sick and they are quarantined by government order because they actually have a virus. What's so unique here is that enormous segments of the US population are under something approaching house arrest, even though they are not actually ill. And that's what I think makes this a little different. And I think that's why the frustration is growing. Whether the Attorney General does anything is a different question. There are people who've complained, and just picked a few random examples of somebody complaining on Twitter about how as somebody who knows who's a surveyor, who works alone, who's, as he says, whose job is literally to stand in the middle of a field by himself, is not allowed to work. What's the health benefit to not allowing surveys, land surveys, to take place? Fishermen in Washington can go out on their boats, but they can't fish from the boat. Does that make any sense whatsoever? So you have a lot of these petty restrictions that are giving rise to a lot of public frustration. And then in Greenville, and I'll talk about this when I talk about the cases, in Greenville, Mississippi, the mayor banned church services, drive-in church services, even though the church services were going to be conducted with people sitting alone in their cars with the windows up, listening to the pastor on the radio, distancing even the cars from each other. So in full compliance with CDC recommendations, they wouldn't allow it to take place anyway. There was a lawsuit filed and they ended up backing down, and they wouldn't allow church services, but they would allow drive-throughs for food, and they would allow people to park in parking lots. So it's these sort of petty, irrational, non-health related measures that are getting people extremely frustrated. And then unemployment is surging. You all hear the news. You probably know people. I mean, I know many people who are now unemployed, that the claims have gone through the roof. We're now up to 26 million people in the last month having filed for unemployment. The unemployment rate is really a lagging indicator, but people are talking us going to double-digit unemployment rate, maybe even as high as Depression era levels of 15 or 20%. And I think that's reasonable. I think that could actually happen. There is a massive problem with unemployment, despite many people being eligible. There, in many cities and other locations, there are lines for food banks and food handouts. This is one in Maryland that somebody took from, I assume, a drone or a helicopter. The lines were wrapping around the parking lot in the building itself for people to show up for a bag of food. I think this was in Baltimore. And so this is what is happening. There is a price that is being paid. And unfortunately, the people who are making the decisions and the punditry on cable news and on Twitter and on social media are, for the most part, people who are still employed. So you have a real disparity here. Here's another one. This one was in West Palm Beach, Florida. People lining up with a 7-hour wait in their cars to pick up food at a food bank. So really, we're approaching in 4 weeks depression level sort of food and hunger issues and unemployment issues. So this is an extremely, extremely serious issue. And there's a disconnect between those with jobs and those who don't. And there's also a societal disconnect between the people who work with information and the people and can work remotely and those who work with people. People who work with other people are getting unemployed. People who work with information can work remotely, can use Zoom, can telecommute, whatever you want to call it. So there's this real disparity in the country, which I think is a fissure line that is developing into a problem, that the people making the decisions are not the people feeling the impact of those decisions. It's a break between people who are losing their life savings and livelihoods and those for whom this is just an economic issue. You might have lost money in the stock market. In a year or two, it'll come back. It's almost come back now. But if you have a hairdressing salon, if you have a small restaurant or a diner, If you have a business that you've thrown your life into and you go, you may not come back. That business may be gone. And I don't think of the people making these decisions really understand what is going on in this country. We're also seeing a collapse of the healthcare system, not from the virus. As I said, the virus from a hospital point of view in almost every place in the country is under control as a hospitalization issue or a hospitalization space issue. But people are going to die and they are getting sick from the ban on elective surgeries, procedures, and visits. And these are measurements we may not know for a while. Think about how many women have not been getting mammograms, how many breast cancers will be detected months later than they could have been detected, how many people are not doing other things. And when we talk about elective surgeries, we're not talking about frivolous things like plastic surgery and nose jobs. We're talking about hip replacement. We're talking about real quality of life surgeries and procedures that are not getting done. And I think you will find when we're able to look back on this, that the death toll from the shutdown of the healthcare system is going to approach the death toll from the virus. And that's not just me saying it. A lot of medical people have said that as well. And they're talking about that in Britain as well. The collapse is real because the bread and butter, the routine surgeries, doctor visits, etc. Care New England, which runs many of the major hospitals in Rhode Island, I don't know about Massachusetts, but I think Massachusetts also is facing economic ruin. And the primary care physicians are, according to the local doctors, are facing economic ruin due to the cancellation of elective surgeries, ambulatory sites, and a reduction in office and emergency room visits. Most of the major health systems are laying off workers. Doctors, nurses are getting laid off. Vaccine rates are dropping precipitously. Parents are not, and this has nothing to do with the anti-vax movement. Parents are not taking their children to the doctor, and they now are beginning to fear a measles epidemic. Because we have so shut down the country, we may beat the coronavirus epidemic, but we may be facing measles and other epidemics. And measles is an extraordinarily transmittable virus. I think maybe even more so than coronavirus. Quest Diagnostics. You'd think they'd be making a fortune now because of all the testing with regard to coronavirus, but in fact, they're laying people off because people aren't going for routine blood tests. And of course, those routine blood tests not getting done may not be uncovering medical conditions that will cause people serious injury. So people will die from what we are doing. And so the choice, the policy choice that we face in the country is not between no deaths and a lot of deaths. It's going to be a lot of deaths no matter what. And that is leading to social strife because we are shutting down people's lives with no real end. And the center is holding so far, but I'm not sure for how much longer that can go. I think my original projection that May, maybe early June is about all the country can handle. I think that's going to end up being correct. There is a huge disparity politically. These numbers are surprisingly high to me as to how many people feel that these prohibitions should be in place. But the one thing that's important to understand is that there is a huge party difference in terms of how this is going on. The other thing is that there are protests that are beginning to take place that are hold on just one second. Sorry about that. Had to deal with a technical issue unexpectedly. So you can see that in Wisconsin, protests have broken out already. That at least multiple people are being arrested on beaches. So people are beginning to disregard these restrictions. They're beginning to take the law, so to speak, into their own hands. Some sheriffs, not a lot, but you're beginning to see issues about law enforcement questioning some of the seemingly petty and inconsequential restrictions that are being placed on people. There's an online crackdown going on at the urging of government. YouTube has announced that anything anybody puts on YouTube that contradicts a recommendation of the World Health Organization will be removed. Well, remember, the World Health Organization is the one that said there shouldn't be travel restrictions back in January and February. So why are we deferring to the World Health Organization? There's a lot of pressure on Facebook to shut down organizing events that are taking place on Facebook, to organize protests. And what Facebook has decided under government pressure is to not allow people to organize events if the event would violate whatever the state or local rules are on public appearances. Let's get now to the law, finally, now that we have a little bit of the background. A lot of amendments that are being implicated, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise, abridging speech or the press, right of the people to peaceably assemble, Second Amendment having to do with right to keep and bear arms, Fourth Amendment about unreasonable searches and seizures without probable cause, Fifth Amendment in terms of not being deprived of liberty without due process of law. And that's, I think, what the Attorney General is getting to with the issue of whether this amounts to house arrest, what people are going through. And states' rights is another issue that's in effect here. And the 14th Amendment, again, not depriving people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Key case, still cited by the courts, still discussed a lot, is Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 1905 case, had to do with the imposition of a requirement for smallpox vaccinations in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and someone objected to the city being essentially ordered to get smallpox vaccinations. The key sentence that still gets cited a lot is that basically, yes, we have a constitution, but the society has a right to protect itself against diseases. And that if society does not have a means to maintain order and to maintain health, that it would dissolve into disorder and anarchy. And then the principle of self-defense, that a community has the right to protect itself against an epidemic of disease which threatens the safety of its members. And that's a key concept. And that is why you're going to see any court being very reluctant to second guess local health officials or state health officials. The big limitation is that the restraints and these restrictions on people's liberty have to have a real and substantial relation to protecting the public health and public safety. So the question, I think, if there are court cases or when there are court cases, is are the restrictions necessary for maintaining, the health? The law of pandemics, a couple of places to start. Not a topic that I was familiar with before. It's something I've studied up on. There's not a lot of law on it, at least case law, but there's a lot of court cases now. And I think that's because we've never had these sort of sweeping societal shutdowns. You can go to the CDC website and they have a guide, handy guide to the legal issues with links and the federal and state laws with regard to quarantine and isolation. Very handy resource. The federal law, this is from the CDC website, is Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, which enables the Secretary of Health and Human Services to take measures to prevent the entry and spread of communicable diseases from foreign countries and between states. And so that's why the federal government does have authority to stop the interstate spread of disease. So it's obviously an extremely broad authority. And then there are various regulations that enable the CDC to act under that authority. And states, almost every state, or I'd say every state, has its own health laws to deal with in-state health issues and in-state pandemic issues. 42 U.S. Code 264. 264 is the federal statute that regulates what the federal government can do and its authority. And that is something that gives the federal government a fair amount of authority, and it's pretty much what I read you before. They can apprehend people. And what's important here is that this authority is to prevent the spread, and it allows them to not only quarantine people who have a disease, but people who've been exposed to it. I'm not sure that is an authority similar to what's taking place throughout our country now, but clearly it's not limited to quarantining people who actually have the disease. So it's people who are at the communicable stage or pre-communicable stage under the federal statute. And federal law preempts any inconsistent state law. National Conference of State Legislatures has a handy guide to state statutes. So if you want to find out what your state statute is, go to the National Conference of State Legislatures. They note that every state, District of Columbia, and most territories have laws under their state health laws. They talk about quarantine and isolation and the distinction between them. The quarantine is for people who've been potentially exposed to a disease, and isolation is for people who are suspected of actually having the disease. And they have a handy guide to all of those laws. The law of pandemics are also cases. We talked about the Jacobson case. There's another case that predates the Jacobson case from 1900, dealt with the bubonic plague in San Francisco district, and an order which required that people get vaccinated and be quarantined, or should they be quarantined for the bubonic plague. So it essentially shut down the District of San Francisco, similar to what's happening in our country now. Now that quarantine ended up being partially undone. So some people mistake this case for the proposition, that you can't shut down an entire part of society. But in fact, the reason that was rejected because the San Francisco order only quarantined people of Chinese ancestry. So it was held discriminatory in violation of the 14th Amendment. But the court did, and also these people opposing the quarantine order disputed with medical evidence that bubonic plague actually was present in San Francisco. So it's very different than the current situation, but the court did allow an injunction which permitted the health board to maintain a quarantine to the extent it has reason to believe places are infected by contagious or infectious diseases. So that would seem to support, of course, that's not on a national scale, but that would seem to support government power in areas where there appears to be a contagious disease. Another case from the District of New Jersey, much more recent in 2016, upheld a relatively short quarantine on somebody who had been a healthcare worker in West Africa where there was Ebola. And when she returned to the US to the airport, was held under observation for 80 hours. And the court said that was okay. And the court went back to these old cases and talked about these concerns about government power, and that in her case, the 80-hour quarantine did not suggest that it was arbitrary or unreasonable given the threat of Ebola. Very recent case, a couple of weeks ago, In re Abbott, Abbott being the governor of Texas, who had passed a regulation or issued a regulation essentially shutting down most non-essential businesses, and that was challenged because one of those businesses that was shut down was the abortion business, the providing of abortions along with other surgeries that were not immediately life-threatening. And there's language in there, even though the case revolved around the issue of whether abortion would be treated differently than other surgeries. The court has language which I think indicates that if there was a broader challenge to the law, it would be upheld, the shutting down of non-essential businesses. Quoted language from the Jacobson case from that early 1900s case, and stressed that court review is available about a law or a statute only if it has no real or substantial relation to health concerns. So if it's pretextual. And the bottom line is this, the court said, that when faced with a society-threatening epidemic, a state may implement emergency measures that can curtail constitutional rights so long as the measures have some real or substantial relation to the public health crisis and are not arbitrary or unduly oppressive. And the courts will not second guess the wisdom or efficacy of these measures. And this is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in a very recent case. So the likelihood that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, or really any court, is going to second guess public health authorities for a restriction that seems related to public health and maintaining public health, I think is pretty slim. And the court continued to go through that this current pandemic in the country seems to be legitimate and rapidly escalating, and that these actions the state took seem related to that. Now, I want to contrast that with a case in Louisiana where the city of Louisville discriminated on a religious basis, barred a church from having religious services, drive-in religious services. This is a separate case from the one I talked about earlier in Mississippi, but didn't place those restrictions on non-religious organizations. And the court issued an injunction, the federal judge, who's now, by the way, been nominated for the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals, talked about banning religious services even if people remained in their cars, whereas drive-through restaurants and liquor stores were still open and could still operate. And so religious organizations seem to have been treated more harshly than secular organizations. And the court emphasized that the way that the drive-in services were taking place were in accordance with CDC social distancing guidelines, and therefore this clearly was discriminatory. And that Louisville had targeted and issued an injunction against that. But this is very narrow. This is where public health concerns were not questioned. The judge was not questioning the city's ability to ban certain sort of gatherings, but said, if you're going to do that, you can't treat religious organizations more harshly. So implicitly, the court was upholding the restriction as it related more generally. And that, again, the court recognized that this was a legitimate concern Louisville had. They just couldn't do it in a way that discriminated religiously. Another recent case, First Baptist Church v. Kelly in Kansas. Again, it was religious discrimination, and the court issued an injunction against it. Again, looking at the list of places where people could gather, and as long as they socially distanced themselves from another, but not at churches. So that was religious discrimination. The court held that religious activities were specifically targeted for more onerous restrictions than comparable secular, therefore issued an injunction against that. But again, the court did not question the general proposition that society and that the mayor had the ability to restrict public gatherings. Wisconsin has an interesting lawsuit going on now, and this, to the extent anyone is ever going to be successful, and we don't know how this turned out yet, opposition papers aren't due till Tuesday, is essentially saying that the cabinet secretary who implemented the lockdown exceeded her powers. I forget if it's a he or a she, but exceeded her powers. And so this is not questioning whether the right person could issue this, but they're saying that that person who issued the order didn't have the power. So it's essentially looking at the statute and looking at the regulations and looking at the procedures that needed to be used and challenging it that way, not generally challenging the state's ability to control a pandemic. So my conclusions is that people who are upset that their constitutional rights are being curtailed, and they are, should not, except in specific instances such as religious discrimination, expect court relief. It's highly unlikely that a court would enjoin a general stay-at-home order unless there was a particularly onerous aspect of it. For example, if they said you can't go to the store to buy food, even though you're not sick. If they said that you couldn't do other things that were not health related. And certainly there have been those sort of restrictions placed on people. And there have been protests over that, and some of those are being taken a new look at or eased because of those protests and the outcry. Again, the political process working, not the judicial process. Attempts to criminalize speech. So banning public gatherings or banning speech by coercing Facebook and YouTube to shut people down, I think, or to criminalize advocacy of certain things, I think would be problematic. I could see a court getting involved there. I would certainly recommend that anybody who were to protest or object do so following the CDC distancing practices for two reasons. One, it probably promotes the public health. But two, if you're going to be criminally charged or if you are going to challenge this in court, I think it's very important to show that you did not pose a threat to the public health, and therefore whatever restriction was being placed on you or prosecution of you was not related to the public health. But when you get down to it, saving the economy and the healthcare system is going to be a matter of politics, in which health concerns play an important role. But these are going to be mostly political decisions. They are not going to be, Not going to be judicial decisions that are going to get imposed on people. Now we'll go through some legal insurrection questions. But saving the economy. So the first one was from Randy, and the issue is One second.
Okay, you want me to read that one for you?
Yeah, if you would read that.
Okay, so first of all, I want to address very quickly the technical issues that we've had, and thank you so much for bearing with us. This is new technology to us, and our test runs, everything worked well, but of course today it's a little wonky, but we're learning as we go as well. So thank you for bearing with us as we figure this out in the middle of a global pandemic, just like everyone else. And thank you, first of all, to the readers who took the time to carefully weigh this topic and submit questions for Professor Jacobson. So the first question we have comes from Randy S., and he asked on the website, Trump has not used overbearing federal power, but the draconian orders are being made by governors, mayors, town councils, etc. Maybe there will be a court case one day that reverses some of the harm, but it seems what we can do to avoid or curb some of the excesses is to get state constitutions changed to not allow such extreme police powers. Does Professor Jacobson think this is where efforts should be made? Poor governors may be recalled or not reelected, but unless these states and local laws are changed, the next person who comes along can do it all over again whenever the next emergency arises. Where should the legal response to these abuses be focused the most? Great question.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to change a state constitution. I don't think you'll ever get people to say that the state can't enact public health provisions. So I think that probably is not a likely avenue that's going to work. I think that the political process, the issue of protesting, calling people up, organizing online, bringing that sort of pressure to bear is more likely to get you what you want. But I think the likelihood of restricting, getting the state, getting the legislature, I guess you could do it by ballot initiative in some states. That would probably be the only way, but I don't think that's going to be successful, particularly where we're just getting through a pandemic where 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people die. I just don't see that as a likely avenue.
Okay, and this next question comes from a legal insurrection reader commenting as Como chief. What do you believe is the most direct route to reining in overreaching officials? The DOJ issuing advisory opinions to set the boundaries of constitutional action, suits in federal court by citizens to remedy civil rights violations. The temporary measures put in place by executives at the state and local level don't seem to have an effective end date. Should Congress, courts, legislators be taking steps to place a front-end time limit upon emergency powers before the executive is required to get affirmative approval from the legislature to continue them beyond, say, 30 days?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Some time limit on the executive's ability, similar to some limits that Congress regularly tries to place on the president, that the president can only take certain actions and has to go to Congress for approval within a period of time. So I think that probably makes a lot of sense, that if the executive under these statutes or health laws has to, at some point, not on an emergency basis, but can essentially keep a state under lockdown forever without getting some sort of participation and input from the legislative branch, I think that would be a worthy endeavor, because you're not questioning the ability to fight a pandemic, but you are saying that the executive needs to consult with the legislature at some point in time.
Okay, and this one, again, from Legal Insurrection reader commenting as American Human. What legal effect does an executive order have on the ordinary citizen? What about an executive order from a governor for his or her state?
Well, the executive orders generally take place under a statutory authority that's been granted to the executive. So They do have the force of law under the health laws, health statutes, for things like communicable diseases and quarantine. So we can maybe debate more generally what legal effect an executive order has for other things, but when it comes to public health, the executive acting under the authority given to the executive under these statutes, I think it has the force of law. And most states, if not all states, provide for criminal penalties for people, for example, who break quarantine when they're under a quarantine order.
Okay. And the next question comes from Legal Insurrection Reader, commenting as RNJD. As a now retired defense counsel, I closely follow developments in my former profession. As discussion intensifies over treatments and vaccines to combat this coronavirus and any that may follow, we're noticing increasing conversations within the plaintiff's bar concerning possible class action lawsuits against pharmacological companies for, as yet speculative, injury to people as a result of a new or innovative drug. While researchers race to develop life-saving treatment and the population cries out for something that will work, a certain segment of society appears to be hoping to profit from failure. Frankly, that disgusts me. Disgusts me too. I'd like the professor to opine on what possible additional legal remedies and/or legislative safeguards can be put into place relative to this pandemic to prevent commercials such as, if you've been injured by the hydroxychloroquine, ... from taking over our airways in a few months.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that's always shocked me whenever I spend a lot of time at home during the day are the lawyer commercials. They're really horrible. And I say that as someone who spent most of his career as a plaintiff's lawyer, but never did TV advertising. They're really bad, and I expect they're going to be bad for this. I think that there's going to be a lot of blame that's going to want to go around. And I know there's been talk, whether it's been done, I'm not sure, of including some sort of liability protection in some of these congressional bills that have gone through. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at, because you can imagine there is an almost endless supply of potential defendants. If somebody gets ill, were they exposed to the virus by another person? Was that person negligent? I mean, it could be never ending, could be to medical providers, could be a whole lot of things. And maybe in other contexts that might be legitimate for a lawsuit, but with a highly communicable virus that's infecting major portions of the population, I think, and doctors might be afraid to give certain medications that are okay with by the FTC for off-label use, but it might raise liability issues. I think some legislatures and the Congress are going to have to take a look at this, because what we don't want to happen is that we now spend the next 6 to 8 years litigating this pandemic. I think that would be a real societal mistake.
I completely agree. And then this next question comes from reader LC. Would one please address the mail-in ballot issue?
This has to do with what New York State just announced. They are mailing a postcard or something like that to every voter in the state where they can request an absentee ballot. I think there are two competing issues here. There's one which is permitting absentee ballots, where there is a procedure to verify the voter. I know I have voted absentee many times, and you have to sign certain certifications. And I won't say it's difficult, but there's paperwork that needs to be done, and they check your signature against your prior signatures and all that sort of stuff. I don't think that's a big threat. I think what's the bigger threat is just saying we're going to complete mail-in ballots, and also that we're going to allow this ballot harvesting, where somebody gets between the voter and the election board. The voter is sending it in directly by the US Postal Service to the election board. That's much less of a potential threat in my mind than where you have some political operative picking up ballots from people. And who knows what goes on there. So I think the mail-in ballot is going to be happening. Multiple times that Nancy Pelosi and others tried to force into these funding bills to fight the virus. National mail-in balloting, I don't think that's going to happen. So that's my view on it, is absentee ballots are perfectly appropriate. And if somebody wants to do it the right way with the right safeguards, that's fine. But I don't think you should just do all mail ballots, or you should have these harvesters where political operatives are picking them up from people.
Okay, and this one comes from Legal Insurrection Reader and a longtime Twitter friend of mine, Phineas Farquhar. Our system is designed to leave the states with broad, undefined police powers to deal with internal emergencies, as opposed to the Fed's limited defined powers. We've seen states and localities seemingly push those powers far beyond what's needed and in often capricious ways, for example, in New Jersey and Michigan. What are the limits to these police powers, and with the incorporation of much of the Bill of Rights against the states, does the Fed have a role to play in reining in at least the worst abuses? The DOJ has made some rumblings. Are citizen court challenges likely to succeed, as happened in Kentucky? And thank you for hosting this. Well, you're welcome. And fantastic questions.
Yeah, I think I've covered a lot of this ground before, is what I think is likely to happen. But I think William Barr's comments alone had a big impact, because we were getting into a situation where you were essentially under house arrest. We don't normally do that to people. And we're talking about house arrest for hundreds of millions of people who are not actually ill. And that's really unprecedented. So I do think the feds are watching this. I don't expect them to do anything legally, except in particular cases. And the feds did intervene in the, I forget if it was the Louisville or the Mississippi case. I think it was the Mississippi case, where they filed in support of the part of the church challenging it. The city ended up backing down, but that's a step where the feds did get involved. But I don't know what else they're going to do. But I think a combination of the protests, combination of the, more than anything, the economic and healthcare disaster that we're going through right now is what's motivating some politicians to consider reopening states. But even there, you see the fear mongering, you see the social media where they're already calling people murderers and death is on your hands. So they're trying to, people are, for political purposes, trying to create a situation where you can't reopen even at all for fear that someone might die. But you know what? People are dying because of these restrictions. Like I said early on in today's presentation, it's not a choice between no one dying and a lot of people dying. A lot of people are going to die if we continue on the current economic trajectory, but there won't be deaths that are going to take place on CNN and MSNBC. There are going to be people committing suicide. There are going to be people getting diseases that may not be discovered for months because they didn't get the mammogram, or they didn't get the blood test, and they didn't get other things. There are going to be deaths, and there are going to be illnesses that take place away from the TV cameras, but they're still real deaths and they're still real illnesses. So I think that that's what's driving everything. I'm not sure what else the federal government will do.
Okay, well, it's not the end, because we do have questions from people who've been watching on Facebook Live.
Great.
So I'm going to get those to you one by one. So this one speaks a little bit more to the very real threat that, and we've seen this discussed quite a bit, in terms of the potential for having to show proof of vaccination when and if a vaccine is created for COVID-19. And this question comes from Harris. And Harris says, Professor Jacobson, thank you. Once a vaccine is tested and approved, do you expect there to be legal challenges under state and federal constitutions if it is required that citizens show proof of vaccination to attend public events, similar to religious groups who now refuse to have medical procedures performed?
Well, that's an interesting question. The issue of kind of interstate travel, things like that. We certainly have vaccination requirements for children attending school, for other things like that. So I don't know what the legal implications, I mean, this is not something I looked at before right now. I don't know what the legal implications would be of a proof of vaccination law. I know that exists again in certain institutions like public schools, but I could see us going there, that if you want to renew your license, your motor vehicle license, you have to present proof of vaccination. If you want to do a whole bunch of other things. So I think there will be a push to get close to 100% vaccination. There'll be requirements in school. There may be requirements in many other places. I don't know how they would monitor it for public events like sporting events, things like that. So I'm really not sure where that's, I think that's going to be a push. I'm just not sure what the legal implications are.
And do you think too, especially with the societal, I guess, the social revolt we're already seeing, do you think that that would play into a requirement like this if something like that were to come down?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think that the public protests have had a huge impact. I think that several thousand cars descending on Lansing, Michigan had a huge impact. So I think that the gathering outside the Wisconsin State House had a big impact. So I do expect there would be protests, but I would not expect that sort of revolt, if you say it's that, for a vaccination requirement. I just don't see that. My sense is that would not spark something.
Okay. Next question comes from Michael again, who left his question on Facebook Live. It's something that we've had quite a bit of experience with at Legal Insurrection in terms of demonetization and being banned or restricted on various platforms. Michael asks, or I guess says rather, Google is demonetizing and closing YouTube accounts because they disagree with their medical opinions. How is this even legal?
Well, it's legal because YouTube, which is owned by Google, is a private company, and private companies can run their business the way they want to run them. The theory is that if you don't like YouTube, you can go someplace else. But I think there's a competing interest, which is that we now have near monopolies. I mean, we're doing this on Facebook. I think we might also be broadcasting to YouTube. I don't really know. We were going to maybe try that as well. But if you can't be on YouTube and you can't be on Facebook, your ability to reach people is dramatically cut down. And so I think there have been some lawsuits, but when you have reportedly Facebook shutting down event organizing at the request of government, I think it raises a legitimate question, if that happened, about whether Facebook is now no longer just a private company. And so I think these are issues, but these are issues that are not new to this pandemic. These are things we've been dealing with. We once lost our YouTube account. We managed to get it back. We've had our own problems with Facebook on their fact checking that we disagree with, and it's something of a black hole. And if they restrict your page, you go from being seen by tens of thousands of people a day to being seen by tens of people a day. So we've been fighting those battles, as is every conservative site that I'm aware of. And so I think that this notion that if you disagree with what the World Health Organization says, you lose your account, I think is really dangerous. And so I don't know where this is going, but it's probably legal. But again, public pressure needs to be brought to bear on these companies. By the way we got our YouTube, it's amazing how we got our YouTube account back. And we also got our Elizabeth Warren Wiki Facebook page back miraculously after Fox News contacted Facebook seeking comment on why we were shut down. Then miraculously, we had the ability to bring some public pressure to bear. But if you're just somebody who doesn't have that ability, then you're out of luck. It's a scary situation. It's something maybe we should hold another live event. And I've spoken about this to people about, I consider the centralization of internet social communication in a handful of companies to be a much greater danger than government censorship is likely to be.
I completely agree, and I'm going to write that down for discussion next week because I think that's a wonderful idea. So this question again from Facebook comes from Ellen, and Ellen asks, if leaders of a municipality or county and a state have two sets of guidelines, who wins?
Well, you can think of it as a federal law generally preempts state law where it so provides. And I showed you that US statute that says it preempts any contrary state public health law. State generally trumps, no pun intended, trumps local jurisdictions. So if there's a conflict between local and state, then state would normally prevail. A lot of times states delegate to local authorities certain powers, so it wouldn't necessarily conflict. But if there is a true conflict, the state is going to prevail.
Okay, and this will be our final question, again from Facebook Live. This is Harris again. He's posted some really great questions this evening. And this is discussing, which is the topic of the whole discussion, constitutional changes. And he says, Professor Jacobson, there has already been a touch of federalism discussion playing out publicly, which as a 10th Amendment lover, I really appreciate. It's been really fun to watch liberals in particular learn to appreciate federalism. But anyway, my diatribe. At the end of the day, will it be the federal or state governments that will determine requirements on citizens? Either way, would you expect constitutional challenges?
Well, it's interesting the way this started, if you recall, long ago, like 3 weeks ago. Trump was basically being berated for not taking a more aggressive posture in terms of the states. That the complaint was, we're allowing states to do different things. Why doesn't the federal government just take it over? And he said, well, there's this thing called the Constitution and they get to do that. Then when he suggested that, well, maybe this federal government has the power to reopen, people said, well, wait a second, why are you doing that? They now flipped and took the exact opposite and said, you have to leave it to the states. So I don't view constitutional challenges as likely because I don't believe the federal government is going to directly order a state to do something. What they will say is, if you want this enormous multi-billion-dollar pot of money that we're offering to states, well, then you have to do the following things. And that, I think, is purely legal. That happens all the time. So I don't envision Trump issuing an order telling states what to do, but that doesn't mean the federal government, whether it's him as president or anybody else, doesn't have enormous leverage over what states do and don't do because they receive federal government money.
Okay, that is all I have from the questions on Facebook Live. And I want to thank everyone sincerely for being patient as we try to figure this out. And we look forward to seeing you next time we do this, because we do plan on doing more live events and hopefully the technology will cooperate just a little bit better. But as always, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for reading. I say this often and write this often. I truly believe that we have the country's or the internet's best readership. We have a very engaged readership. And thank you for contributing. Thank you for your questions. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in and to Professor Jacobson for taking the time to educate us on something that is very timely and incredibly important.
Great. Take care and see you at the website.
All right. Bye, y'all. Thank you.